Tell us about Living the Braveheart Life, your new book that's coming out in September.
This is the 20th anniversary of Braveheart, and
Wow.
and I've found as I've gone around the world that if you ask men what their favorite movie is, I think more people would say Braveheart than any other.
Yes.
And reflecting on that caused me to realize that manliness is under attack. There are lots of men, but there are lots of males, but there aren't a lot of men. And I think the crisis in America and probably throughout the world is that not enough fathers are teaching their sons to be men, and it's probably because they don't know how to be men themselves. And I began to reflect on what kind of man I want to be, and how Braveheart, for me, writing that 20 years ago was my coming to terms with the man I wanted to be.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. And I know you got the idea you got inspired to write Braveheart from a trip to Scotland.
Yes. Yeah, my first son was on the way, and I didn't know anything about my own roots. My wife had Mormon ancestors, and so she knew her ancestry way back, and I didn't know any of mine. And I had heard about a man named William Wallace when I went to Scotland, and that led me into the whole story of Braveheart. And it also led me to explore the relationship of fathers and sons. And then I began to discover that there were a lot of women for whom this kind of thing was profoundly relevant.
Yeah.
You know, that women were feeling in our modern times that they wanted a real man to come along. You know, and where was that man, and how could they be involved in a life that mattered? You know, that we're not just going through this world from sunrise to sunset to lie down and say, well, I got through it. We want to live vibrantly and fully. And that's what the story became for me, and that's what I wanted to explore more in this book.
What was the process of writing this book like? How long did it take you to write it? Did you have a set schedule, or did you just write when you had free time? How did that work?
That's a great question. I approach this differently than my screenplays. I've written a lot of screenplays. Screenplays are strongly structural. With this, I wanted to discover what the story was, and I wanted to write about where the story Braveheart came from internally, in my own soul. So that required a lot of wandering around. I would just tell a story that was relevant. Storytelling is, I think, the way we convey our values. We convey what is really important to us. I think that's why the Bible is written mainly in narrative form. It's not philosophical. It's here's a story that tells you who you are and who you might become. And I tell the stories that made me who I am. The stories of my father's life, my mother's life, and how those intertwined into causing me to want to be a writer and the kind of stories I wanted to tell.
Do you have any advice for aspiring writers, especially those who want to sort of break into Hollywood, which is notoriously difficult to break into?
I tell you, I've thought about this a great deal, and I don't have a checklist. With every truth, there's an opposite sort of paradoxical fact. But one for me is, people say write what you know. I'm not sure what that means. I think you write what your heart is drawn to, because standing out is important. Being different is important. And we're all made differently, but we're all afraid to stand up and say, this is who I am. This is how I'm different. And it's really only in doing that we have value. We think we need to unite, but that doesn't mean we need to homogenize and give up all the things that make us who we are, the longings of our hearts. So I think you have to write from the longing of your heart. I think you have to, in doing that, you have something unique to give the world. And that makes you stand out. When I wrote Braveheart, Everything else in Hollywood was a contemporary action-adventure story. Like, you're doing Die Hard or Lethal Weapon or those movies.
Yeah.
The idea that a story of a man running around in a kilt 700 years ago who was beheaded and disemboweled at the end of the story. If I walked into most meetings and said, this story is going to be inspiring and uplifting to millions of people, they would have thrown me out of the office. Interesting, by the way, is that the person who first saw it was a woman. And if it had not been for her name is Rebecca Pollock Parker. She's the daughter of Sidney Pollock. If it hadn't been for Becky Pollock, I don't think Braveheart would have ever seen the light of day.
Really?
But I told her the story, and she looked at me and said, you must go write that. And that's why I believe that this whole thing about what men need is what women need.
Yeah, I agree. And now you've also directed a lot of big Hollywood movies. It's obviously so different from writing a screenplay or writing a book. Do you feel like you bring the same qualities though to that, or do you have to sort of completely switch gears?
There are many of the same qualities. It's sort of like interconnecting circles. There's a part that's unique in each one and a part where they coincide. The part that coincides is that it's a storytelling function. You have to understand what is the heart of this. In directing, and I'm sure you experience this in doing exactly what you do, you say to yourself, what can we discover? What's going to surprise us? But at the end, you're saying to yourself, why do we want this? What was our hope at the beginning, and where do we find it now? At the editing process of a movie, I'll be saying, what's the story really about? And that question will help inform how the final product is made. But the big difference is that writing is a profoundly personal, isolated process, and directing is a public process. Directing is pulling everybody together into a vision and having that dialogue with discovery. When an actor will come out and do a scene that you didn't see coming, that's like God just zapped you with a lightning bolt. You feel, wow, that's magic. It's like seeing your own child smile for the first time at something, or say something you didn't expect them to say. But that process happens in writing. It's just you alone in the room, and that's a different thing.
Yeah. And what's the most important thing that you want readers to get out of Living the Braveheart Life? If you could say it like in one sentence.
I haven't been asked that, but that's a wonderful thing to try to do. I think what I would say this morning here in New York at 11:30 is that to live a full life requires you to face the things that make you the most afraid. It requires you to face death. What you would be willing to give your life for. If you don't find that, you haven't found life yet. If you find what is greater than your own life, then you find life in your own life. Now that might sound philosophical, but I believe it to the depth of my being. And that's what this story was about for me, and this book is about for me, and what life is about for me is, where do you find the life that says every man dies, not every man really lives. We all want to really live. That's what I'm looking for.
Now, is there anything I haven't asked that you'd love to share with our viewers?
The thing that I'd really like to share with your viewers is that it impresses me that you even wanted to talk with me about this, that for a thoughtful, caring woman, this is a book I would like women to read. I would love to know what women feel, when they're looking for this, because I know so many women who are in the struggle to find a meaningful relationship with a man, and so many men who are that way. And when I look at the landscape of life, I think there's so many wonderful men and so many wonderful women. And why have they not found the kind of partnership that makes 1 and 1 equal more than 2?
Yeah.
That to me is the thing that intrigues me most about this, and that I would love this process to be.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because I agree with you. I have, women friends all the time say who are single say, "Oh, I just want to find a real man."
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a friend, Jill Connor Brown's a best-selling author, and she has a lot of women write her emails, and she had a woman writer from the Pacific Northwest, and she had moved from Mississippi to Oregon or Washington, and she wrote Jill in Mississippi and said, "I can't find a man here." And Jill said, "What's wrong with the men there? They seem like they'd be great." And she said, "Well, in Mississippi, the men all smell like gasoline. In Oregon, they all smell like Starbucks coffee." That's a question. What do they smell like? Nothing against Starbucks coffee, but in a certain way, it's like, what's the fragrance of someone's soul? And I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking with
Thank
us.
you,
And